I'm really excited to have Keriann McGoogan joining us. Keriann is not only a friend of mine, but she is an amazing scientist. She's an explorer. She's traveled to the wilds of Madagascar to study lemurs in their natural habitat. She recently released her first book, Chasing Lemurs, which chronicles her time as a young graduate student, the adventures that she did have, the challenges she faced, everything from food poisoning to grueling hikes to local politics, malaria, backcountry roads, you name it. Everything was thrown her way, but she persevered, and it's an incredible story. So I highly suggest that you check it out. I'm going to bring Keriann in live with us now. Hello, Keriann. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am good. It's been an awesome 2 days. Yesterday, we broadcast for about 10 hours, featuring all kinds of amazing women, scientists, explorers, conservationists, adventurers. We bounced around the world. It was a ton of fun. And we are just rolling right along today and excited to hear a little bit about your adventures.
Well, I'm excited to share that with you. So I can just share my screen.
Absolutely. I'm going to let you take over for a bit.
Perfect. All right. So thanks so much for having me. It has been an amazing few days, a day and a half of events so far. It's really an honor to be part of this amazing festival. So thanks, Joe, for having me. So as Joe mentioned, I'm here to talk a little bit about my adventures in Madagascar, which I tell the story of my very first trip to Madagascar in my recent book, Chasing Lemurs. So this tells the story of the very first time I visited that country, and I was just 25 years old. So to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm a trained primatologist, which just means that I know how to study primates. So those are monkeys, apes, and of course, lemurs. So I have my PhD in biological anthropology, and that's what brought me to Madagascar. But I have to say, especially with regards to this amazing festival, I was really inspired by the many amazing researchers who came before me, and many of them were really amazing women. And one who was on this slide is the incomparable Jane Goodall. So she particularly inspired me. I knew that she had traveled to Tanzania to study the chimpanzees when she was just 26 years old. And at the time of my very first trip to Madagascar, I was just 25. And so I really idolized her and looked up to her, and she provided a lot of inspiration for me. So that's why I call the first chapter of Chasing Lemurs, Jane Goodall is Not Alone. Besides being inspired by the other incredible women who came before me, and especially Jane Goodall, I was also inspired by Madagascar itself. In the book, I talk about Madagascar as being a world unlike any other. So to give you an idea, it's an island situated off the southeast coast of Africa. It's the fourth largest island in the world after Greenland, New Guinea, and Borneo. So it's about the size of Alberta or France. And what makes it unique is because it's an island, it's been separated from the mainland for millions of years and isolated. And so evolution has kind of exploded on this island. It's occurred in kind of a microcosm. This incredible country has more endemic species than any other place in the world. Endemic just means that they're found only there and nowhere else on the planet. So as an example, they have some really incredible bird species, like this crested kua, which has this beautiful eye coloration that kind of makes it look like Lady Gaga or Cyndi Lauper, depending on your generation, I suppose. And along with those endemic species, it's got incredible diversity. So it's not just birds. There's also some amazing other creatures like this leaf-tailed gecko. This is a satanic leaf-tailed gecko that disguises itself to look kind of like a dead leaf blowing in the wind. Then you have some amazing chameleons. Over half of the world's chameleons are actually found in Madagascar, and that includes the world's largest and smallest chameleon. And in fact, just last week, they found a new species of chameleon, a nano chameleon, which is the tiniest, I think the tiniest reptile in the world. They also have some really bizarre insects that I don't think anyone could ever have dreamed up. This is a giraffe-necked weevil, and to me it's like an alien species, like something off another planet. But besides all of that, for me, it was the lemurs that brought me to Madagascar. And I think when you see this image of this bamboo lemur, you can see why. This might be the cutest lemur that exists, but we can talk about that a little bit more later. But these guys have a specially adapted digestive system that allows them to digest bamboo and the toxins in bamboo, just like a panda. But they're not the only species of lemur. There's actually 111 different species, and all of those lemurs are found only in Madagascar and nowhere else on the planet. So this one's pretty recognizable. This is a ringtail lemur. You probably recognize it from the DreamWorks cartoon, Madagascar, and the famous King Julian. But I think fitting for this festival, an interesting fact about this species is that they're actually female dominant, and that's true of a lot of other species of lemur. So when we say King Julian, it actually maybe should have been Queen Juliet, arguably. But each of the lemur species is unique. This is a nocturnal species of lemur called a Sport of Lemur, and you can tell that they're nocturnal. They're actually poking out of their sleeping site during the day here, but they have these really huge eyes that they use to see in the dark. This one here is an Indri. This is maybe my personal favorite. This is actually the largest living lemur. And they are distinguished because they make a really haunting call that sounds almost like they are like a trumpet. And they use that call for group spacing. So to tell the other groups, you know, I'm over here, we're feeding, don't come over this way. Many lemurs use a special form of locomotion, which you can see in this picture here. So this is called vertical clinging and leaping. And so they'll actually propel themselves off of one vertical substrate, so like a tree trunk, to another. And they can clear about 10 meters in one of their jumps, which made my job a little bit harder because I had to follow them through the forest. But in the book, I joke that they're like a hyped up version of Spider-Man. And I think you can see why in this photo. But what drew me to Madagascar wasn't just how incredible and amazing the wildlife and the lemurs especially are. In 2006, when I went to Madagascar for that first time, I also knew that lemurs are highly endangered. And today, they actually have the unfortunate distinction of being the most endangered group of animals on the planet. It's estimated that about 98% of all of those 111 different species and subspecies of lemur are endangered. And I learned firsthand from living in Madagascar that that's because of habitat loss and hunting. So when people ask me, you know, why did you go to Madagascar? I tell them that, you know, I wanted to study the lemurs in their natural habitat before it's too late and to contribute research that would help with their conservation. So here I am in 2006 when I was just 25 years old. Young and fresh. So I was heading to this place called Kasiji Special Reserve, which was in the remote northwest of Madagascar. So I was a primatologist in training. I was there with my PhD supervisor, Sean Lehman. And so we would go for 3 months on that trip. And the idea was that we would scout out and set up a field site that I could later go back to for my longer PhD research. So I was interested in understanding how the forest edge, so the border between a forested area and a non-forested area, impacted the lemurs. So it impacted how they behaved, what they ate, and where they traveled in the forest. So Kasiji, you can see circled here on this map, is in the northwest, and it is extremely remote. So to get there, we would have to drive to the nearest village, which was called Kendrihu. And that was about 30 kilometers from Kasiji. So from there, we would have to hike the rest of the way. So we'd hike that 30 kilometers, and it was across some pretty rocky and sandy terrain. And when we got to Kasiji, we would be camping. So this was not glamping, camping. So we would be camping in the bush. We would bring all of our equipment with us. We would have to hire porters to help us carry it that 30 kilometers because we had a lot of stuff for 3 months. When we got there, we would dig our own latrines. We would set up a water filtration system. All of our cooking was done over an open fire. So it was pretty rustic. And because it was so remote, we weren't planning to leave and restock our supplies and come back. We had to be there for the entire 3 months. And so that meant we had to do a lot of planning. And so it ended up being pretty pressure packed for that 3-month project. And so we did a lot of planning. We spent months really developing an intricate plan. This image here is just one of the many maps that we created of the field site in preparation, just using Google Maps. We would print these out and laminate them and figure out all the different routes and terrain that we would be coming across. So we did that. We got our permits. We purchased all our gear and supplies. So we were ready. We were as ready as we could have been. But one important lesson that I learned from this trip is that there's sometimes a really big difference between a plan and reality. And so some really good advice I got from one of my committee members for my PhD was that he said, remember, no proposal survives the field. You have to be able to adapt and revise. And so that was some advice that really stuck with me. And for this trip was really important because I would say that adapting and revising is an understatement for what happened next. So again, we might be wondering why did we put ourselves through all of that planning and all of the challenges that we were about to face? Well, again, it's back to the lemurs. So we went there to study the lemurs in their natural habitat, and in Kasiji, we had the chance to see 8 different species of lemur. And the other really exciting thing about this place, even though it was so remote and hard to get to, was that the fact that it was remote and hard to get to meant that no one else had been there before us. And so we had a lot of really good opportunities to ask new questions and learn new things about the lemurs. So I wasn't going it alone on this journey. In fact, I had a pretty large team of people surrounding me. So this is a picture of the field team. It shouldn't take you too long to find me there. I'm there in the back. I was actually the only woman on this trip. So all of the rest of the field assistants and my supervisor, they're all men. Aside from me and Sean, who was taking this photo, there was Andri and Sahubi. So these two were university students from Madagascar who would be assisting with the project. Besides Sean and me, they were the only other 2 that spoke English. Fidel was our cook, who we hired when we got to Kendrihu. And we also hired 2 local guides, Noel and Jesua, to help us kind of identify the plants and find the lemurs and things like that. And then the rest of the people here are trail cutters. So we had to cut trails through the forest to help us find the lemurs. And you may also have noticed that there's a couple of guys there wearing some military fatigues and carrying rifles. And so the reason for that was because Kasiji was so remote, we were asked by the local officials to bring the members of the gendarme, the Madagascar military, with us because they were concerned for our safety because there were bandits known to roam the area looking to steal people's cattle. So we ended up having to take them with us on our journey. So the first stop on my journey was the capital city of Madagascar, Antananarivo, which we were meant to spend just a few days there, gathering various supplies, mostly food. And from there, we would drive north towards Kasiji. So with the 2 university students I showed you in the photo there, Andri and Sahubi, we went to this local market, the Analakeli market, and stocked up on food. Mostly rice and beans. I will say Madagascar is a rice nation, and so every meal basically consisted of rice in some form. So we ate a lot of it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But in Tana, we actually faced our first major roadblock on our journey. Both Sean and I ended up getting a really nasty case of food poisoning, and we had to go on a course of antibiotics and spend about 5 days in Tana recovering before we could leave for Kasiji. So that kind of delayed us. We ended up leaving a week later than what we thought we would leave. But we tried to shake it off. We packed our equipment. You can see our luggage here. Some of it is actually packed in rice sacks, and that's because that's easier for the porters to kind of strap on to the sticks that they would use to carry it on the hike. And we eventually did leave Tana after we had taken that time to recover. We squeezed into these 2 4x4s and set out on our drive. And the first part of the drive was not too bad. It was along this paved road, about 6 hours from Tana. And at that point, we had to eventually connect with an unpaved road. But the officials kind of let us know that it's the dry season, so it probably wouldn't be too bad. But this is what we actually came across. So those roads that we were told would be decent ended up being very sandy, wet, and had these unexpected patches of mud that we actually had to extricate ourselves from on many occasions. This is just one photo of one of the many times we had to kind of pile out of the vehicles and extricate it from the mud. So that was a really big adventure. But this actually wasn't the worst part of the road. We then came across these rocky boulders of sandstone. And so every time we came to these, we had to all pile out of the vehicles again. And in the book I write, the drivers faced a dilemma each time we came across a rocky area. Go over or go around? Can the vehicle clear that gap? So in all, what we thought would take us a few hours just took us about 6 full hours of driving to get that short distance. But we did eventually make it to Kendrihu, and there we faced yet another challenge because we had a lot of stuff. We had a lot of food, a lot of equipment, and we needed to hire people to carry it that 30 kilometers on the hike to Kasiji. But we had a lot of trouble finding enough people to carry our gear. And in retrospect, it's not a huge surprise because it was hot. The hike was really long, and we had a lot of stuff, and it wasn't light equipment either. So we ended up having to hire a few men as porters. And then we also hired some zebu carts, which you see pictured here. Zebu are like the Malagasy cattle. And so they loaded up our gear on these carts. In Kendrihu, we also got delayed again because Sahubi, pictured here, revealed that he had a terrible throat infection. And so he ended up visiting a doctor in Kendrihu, and we had to spend a couple more days there waiting while he recovered as well. So the problem, I should say, with all of these delays is that I had never been to Madagascar before. This was my first trip. I was really, really relying on Sean and his expertise and experience having worked there before to kind of guide me through the first parts of this project. But he was leaving soon after we would get to Kasiji. And so every day that we lost on the front end meant one less day that we would have together in the field and him helping me set up. And so I was getting really nervous at this point because I was facing kind of going it alone in a place where I had never been. But we did set out on our 30-kilometer hike to Kasiji. So this is just a snapshot of some of that hike. So it was a pretty grueling trek. We had to hike along a lot of sand. We had to cross these bends in the river periodically. And as you might imagine, that hike took us a little bit longer than we thought. The other part of it was that zebu carts, as it turns out, are very slow-moving vehicles. And so they had to stop, water, and graze their cattle. And if there was a few points in the trip where we had designated spots to meet them and they didn't show up. One of those times they had our tents on them, and so we ended up having to sleep in these huts here in a Madagascar village. The other part of it is that the zebu carts could only take us so far. Eventually the road that they were traveling along would end, and so we would have to take all of our equipment off and try to find people to carry it the rest of the way. And that proved really difficult. Like, these were small Malagasy villages, and it was really hard to find enough people to help us carry our equipment the rest of the way. And so this is another part of this kind of roller coaster journey that I'm on. At this point in the trip, I was desperate to see a lemur in the wild. That was why I had gone to Madagascar, and at this point I felt like I never would get to see one. I was getting really worried. So that's why I was really excited when in a small village called Bamuntu, we actually did get to see a lemur. And this was my very first lemur in the wild. This is a mouse lemur. And mouse lemurs are nocturnal. So my first sighting was actually in the dark. We'd spotted them because they had these, we shined our light, and they have a reflective layer in their eye that kind of glows back at you orange in color. And this is a pretty incredible primate to have the honor of being my first lemur. They can fit in the palm of your hand. They're that small. In the book, I write that they reminded me of Stuart Little because they had the intelligence of a primate, but they looked like a mouse. So I was pretty excited. And this also reminded me of why I had gone to Madagascar in the first place. And it helped me to keep going, even though at this point we felt like we would never get there. But we did eventually make it to Kasiji. We were able to, from that village where we saw the lemur, hire a couple of boats to kind of pile up our stuff in and take the rest of the way. And then we hiked to what we hoped would be our last camp here, just 5 kilometers away from Kasiji. So just all in all, from Tana, it had taken us about 12 days and basically every ounce of strength, patience, and determination that I could muster. But just over that rise, I knew that the lemurs awaited. So we managed to set up camp at the site in Kasiji. Sean had just a few days, just 3 days to stay and help us get all set up and help find lemurs along the trails. And then he would have to leave. So it was a lot shorter than we had hoped because that trek in took a lot longer than we thought. And when Sean left, he would be bringing out most of the team with him. He would leave me there with the 2 guides and Andrew and our cook. And at first it was glorious. We kind of got a groove going. We started finding lemurs along the trails. We discovered a lemon grove in the middle of the forest. The camp was next to this beautiful Mahavavi River. And there, lemurs were kind of dropping from the trees. It seemed like they were just right above our tents. This one was pictured right above my tent. But just a few days after Sean had left, unfortunately, my cook Fidel woke me up in the middle of the night and he took me over to Andrew's tent. And there I found that Andrew had a terrible fever. He was shaking uncontrollably and he managed to tell me, I think it might be malaria. So as you can imagine, hearing those words, it had taken us 12 full days to get to Kasiji. We were in deep, remote Madagascar, and Andrew tells me, I think it might be malaria. At that point, I knew that I was about to face the most difficult situation that I could ever imagine of my life. And you can read the rest of that story in Chasing Lemurs. So thanks very much. I'll just stop sharing.
Okay, well, Keriann, leaving us in suspense with the story, but it is a great book. So those who would like to check it out, you can find it Amazon, right, Keriann, and probably independent bookstores as well. So support independent if you can.
Yeah, you can get it anywhere books are sold. And if you can, I would suggest support your local because they probably need the support right now.
All right, absolutely. And the next time we can hang out, I'll have to get you to sign mine for me, even though we're not too far away. Do the right thing with COVID. Well, Keriann, that was great. What a story. Inspirational for young graduate students who are just striking off into the field on their own, who probably are feeling a lot of the same things that you were feeling at the time when you struck out. So I think let's start there. What, you've gone through it. You've successfully been in the field on multiple occasions. What advice would you give a young graduate student, even someone in high school thinking about conservation?
I think look to you just got to get out there and do it. I think the best thing that I did was to get field experience. When I knew that I might be interested in studying primates, the best thing that I could do was actually sign up for a field school. So I actually before I went to Madagascar, I spent some time in Belize where I learned to kind of be a primatologist and do field research and all of the hardships that kind of came along with that. That was where I learned that actually finding monkeys and finding primates in the wild is a lot harder than you might think. So, doing stuff like that, seizing opportunities when they present themselves. And then remembering too, that everything is not going to always go smoothly. That's something I really learned from this particular trip is that, you can have the best laid plans, you can have everything planned out in intricate detail, as much as possible, but something's always going to go awry. And so just being flexible and being ready to kind of pivot what you're doing and finding ways to still contribute to conservation and research. Maybe it isn't exactly how you planned it, but you can still find those outlets. And so I think that was an important lesson that I learned on this particular trip.
All right. Well, we have a question in the chat that usually comes up when we talk about lemurs. We do some work with the Duke Lemur Center. So Fallon is wondering, what is your favorite type of lemur?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question because there's over 100 different species of lemur. I I probably should pick the species that I studied for my PhD, which is a Cockerell's shafaka. So that's the picture on the front of the book here. This guy here. So they are pretty incredible. It's actually the same species as the boomafoo, made famous, a famous TV show that was popular about a decade ago. But I'm also partial to the Indri. I mean, that's the largest species of lemur. They have this amazing call. Seeing them in the wild was one of the most special moments of my life. You know, we hiked out into the forest and we found a group of Indri with the help of the guide, and we ended up sitting down underneath a tree where they were kind of camped out, and just hearing their call in that close proximity was just something that, like, it just is spectacular. I would recommend anyone who, if you have a chance, go to Madagascar and see the Indri.
All right. Amazing. So, you touched on a big issue that is affecting lemur populations. That's deforestation. Are there other pressures that lemurs are feeling in Madagascar?
Yeah, so the biggest threats that face lemurs in Madagascar are forest loss because of deforestation, as you mentioned, but there's also hunting pressures and also the pet trade. So those are the three biggest conservation challenges that lemurs face. And it's a complicated problem because in Madagascar, there's endangered wildlife, but the people in Madagascar are also often living hand to mouth, and they're some of the poorest people in the world. And so when they're cutting down forests to graze their cattle, or if they're hunting lemurs for food, it's a challenging problem because they are just trying to feed their families. And so I actually work with a conservation organization called Planet Madagascar, along with my partner, Travis Steffens, who started it. And so together we try to do what's called community conservation, which means that we work directly with the local communities to really empower them to help the lemurs and to save the lemurs in their own country. And so that's kind of the aim of that conservation project.
All right. One more question from the live chat before we let you go for today. Amy is curious, is your book Chasing Lemurs available as an audio book, or are there plans for that?
No plans as of yet. That may be coming because I think it would be a fun audio experience. Maybe we can get some lemur calls in there or something, but it is available in print and also as an EPUB as well.
All right. Excellent. Well, Keriann, thank you for sharing your story with us today. Thank you for the work you do through Planet Madagascar. I highly suggest anybody tuning in to check that organization out on Twitter for sure. You can find them at Planet Mada. And is it the same for Instagram? Do you know off the top of your head, Keriann?
I think so, yeah.
All right. Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you can stick around a little bit and check out some of the great events we have coming up.
Thanks very much for having me.